Hi, Year 7. This is lesson 2 in our alternate content. Please make sure you're listening to the right video for the right PowerPoint presentation. So, for lesson 2, we're going to introduce you to a new type of poetry. So, last week we looked at haikus and Japanese poetry and how haikus represent how Japanese culture feel about their environment. They're very much in sync with their environment, I think would be a good way of saying it. So now we're going to look at ballads. So, what is a ballad? So, the original ballads were stories. They were stories of passion, adventure, tragedy, death, the supernatural, and legendary people. They originated sometime in the 13th century and were sung as folk music. Now, a ballad is sort of similar, I guess, in a way to how fairy tales were first told. Um, Fairy tales were often in the beginning they rhymed a lot, and it's the same reason why Shakespeare is also written in rhythm and rhyme and poetry sort of stanzas. It's easier to remember something if it rhymes, and it's easier to remember something if it goes with music. So a ballad is kind of an American, especially American, um, idea. It became really popular during that time. So even though it's been around for a very long time since the 13th century, ballads were actually really popular during um, American colonial times when people were trekking across the land and they would stop for the night and they would sit around and they would tell these ballads to each other. So the stories were passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth, and so the words often changed along the way. Because if I told you a story and then I asked you to repeat that story to a friend, you would change some of the words. Either you wouldn't quite remember what I said, and so you're like, oh, this is close enough, or B, you think that you know a better word that's better to use in that example than what I gave you. Um, or C, you're elaborating the story a little bit to make it more interesting for your friend because your friend is really interested in like one particular aspect and you want them to really enjoy it. And then if you ask that friend to tell that story to someone else, okay, it's a little bit like Chinese whispers. It slowly starts to evolve and change as time goes on. So it's really important that when we look at these ballads, that we know that they come from a historical place, but they're not an accurate historical representation. Okay, that's all you really need to know about ballads. They do follow these rules. Now, I know it looks like a lot of rules, but it's really not. So they tell a simple story. Okay, it's not complicated. It's not as long as a fairy tale. I know I compared them to fairy tales, but what I meant was that they're like a fairy tale in the same sense of they are given to younger generations orally or verbally, and that's why it's important that some of them rhyme and stuff. So it's a simple story. It'll have repetitive words, lines, and phrases. Okay, also like fairy tales where you get that same motif going over and over and over, or like nursery rhymes like the Three Little Bears. Someone's been sleeping in my bed, and that idea goes over and over and repeats itself. So you'll see these features in stories that we've already looked at. There'll just be little changes. I'm just going to move this because I didn't realize it was in the way. There we go. Um, there's little changes between what is a ballad, what's a short story, what's poetry, and all that. But yeah, so I'll have a regular rhythm. That's because it would be sung around campfires a lot. It also has a regular rhyming scheme. Okay, they used to be anonymous, so modern ballads do have known poets, but back in the day they were anonymous. So it sort of had that vibe of this happened to a friend of mine, and it made it feel more real. There was a use of dialogue, so the characters within the ballad would talk to each other and interact with each other, and they often had references to death, supernatural, or the weather. And so one of the reasons for that would be because these were the things that were really important to the people of the time. If you look at old ballads and how they reflect on what that society was afraid of or what they were concerned with, okay, death was always a really scary subject, still is, probably always will be. The supernatural is still a scary concept to us. We still talk about ghosts and zombies and all that sort of stuff. And the weather, okay? We know where weather comes from, but when we have a really bad storm, it still gets us a little bit like, agitated. Not scared all the time, but definitely agitated. And back in these times when these ballads were being written, the weather could have a huge impact on what you're doing. So if you imagine you're in the middle of the plains and a huge storm comes in, and then pulls up all this mud and stuff. So then you can't move your wagon, you can't move your horse, you're stuck in the middle of the field. Okay, coyotes are going off in the background. That can be really scary. So when they talk about the weather, we're not talking about, oh, what a lovely, pleasant day. It's not going to be the same sort of casual, I don't know, appreciation, I guess. Like we looked at haikus. Haikus were very much about loving nature and everything nature has to offer. Normally in a ballad, it's the opposite of that. We're kind of hating on everything nature has to offer and what it can do to us. Okay, so our activity for this lesson is, in your own words, what is a ballad? So everything I've told you during this recording, go back and re-listen if you need to. Okay, I just want you to write maybe a sentence or two. What is a ballad? what what do you think a ballad is? If you had to tell your parents or sister what a ballad is, what definition would you give them? And that's it for lesson 2. And I'll see you all in the last one. Bye.